For over 60 years, there has been one brand name so ubiquitous as a place to find affordable footwear. It was Payless, a brand which was born as a discount store which sold shoes differently, and one which grew to truly incredible heights. In just a few decades, their presence across the world would stretch over 5,000 stores with over 30,000 employees. So how did this massive multi-billion-dollar company fall from grace? Not only did they fall, they fell hard. They would declare bankruptcy twice and ultimately fade away entirely. So let's take a look at how all this happened. This is Payless. This video is sponsored by Factor. Go to factor75.com or click the link in the description below and use code 50BSF to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. The footwear retailer was started in Topeka, Kansas by two cousins, Louis and Shael Pazes. They opened their small store in 1956 under the name Payless National, and their idea was simple and quite different for the time. Instead of other shoe stores of the era, which typically had large staff of associates specifically there to assist the customer, Payless was going to offer cheaper goods with the self-service model. Their stores would only employ a few people, while customers were free to try out any pair they wanted from a vast selection of up to 1,000 options. Because Payless didn't have to hire additional staff, they were able to keep costs low, and as a result, they passed those savings on to the consumer with very affordable products. It certainly wasn't a Macy's experience, but with women's shoes, for example, starting as low as $1.98, people flocked to their store. Their first location proved to be very popular with customers, and this allowed the cousins to grow their business. By the end of the 1950s, they had established 21 locations in 4 different states, now growing outside of Kansas to also set up shop in Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. By the early 1960s, Payless continued to grow as they focused more on women's and children's shoes. This segment, which became their most popular, had brought in a very decent cash flow, with the company later posting over $6 million in sales. As the corporation changed its name to Volume Distributors, then to Volume Shoe, they decided to go public with an IPO in 1962. The company raised quite a bit of money through this public offering, now increasing their number of locations to over 42. While they did have a few other brands, Payless would be their largest brand name, and through the 1960s and into the 70s, it would only grow larger. Volume Shoe would embark on major expansion efforts, buying up smaller shoe brands and absorbing their locations into the greater company. This brought their number of locations to over 140 by the early 70s, with sales now topping $10 million. By 1975, however, their locations skyrocketed to over 486, an incredible increase which now brought their presence across the country to over 31 states. This all came with a name change to their primary brand, which was now named to Payless ShoeSource. With a period of high inflation for Americans, Payless just offered a good deal for shoes. They really were the right company at the right time. They also took advantage of the American mall boom, when indoor shopping malls were opening up across the country. Payless was the perfect tenant for such an outlet, and their stores saw great success there. In fact, by the end of the decade, mall locations made up over 40% of Payless's portfolio. Despite this enormous rise, the company continued to maintain a good supplier network and distribution strategy, making their own bespoke brands to always ensure stock. The company also leaned into computerized inventory systems and modern checkouts. This was while their locations continued to only require a small amount of staff, which in return allowed for healthy profit margins. This influx of cash just fueled even more expansion. By the end of the 1970s, Payless had over 739 stores, and this made them a pretty attractive brand for an acquisition. In 1979, May department stores had acquired Payless for around $160 million. This was going to add to May's portfolio of brands, each one attacking their own market segments, Payless being their strong entry into the discount shoe market. Despite this acquisition, if you can believe it, May's only accelerated their growth from here. In just 2 years, they had opened another 350 locations, bringing the total to over 1,089. Louis and Shael Pazes had grown their tiny store to a massive nationwide chain, now owned by one of the largest retailers in the country. Content with their incredible success, by the early 1980s they had retired, while a new executive team had taken over management. This new team would oversee aggressive pricing for their products, focusing on keeping costs low for consumers since more competition had begun creeping up. But this is while their presence continued to escalate. By 1991, Payless now operated over 2,295 locations, which meant the company, during the years prior, had opened on average around 200 new stores every year. They had also now posted over $1.5 billion in sales. While this was tremendous growth, the Mays company began to get cold feet on the future of this massive brand. Mainly in how other growing discount department store brands like Walmart and Kmart would compete against them in the coming years. After Payless acquired the shoe store brands ShoeWorks Inc. and the Kobacker Company, they spent a ton of money to convert their 680 stores to the Payless branded ones. Mays, seeing how much money the company was spending on these acquisitions, along with seeing their potential market share threats, along with the fact that Payless only accounted for around 14% of the company's overall sales, it made them decide to split. In 1996, they spun off Payless to their shareholders, putting the company back on the stock market as its own corporate entity. While Mays would ultimately back off, investors would do the opposite. Within just a year, Payless saw a nearly 70% increase in their stock, making it a very popular brand. It makes sense why though, as the company that year had brought in $2.5 billion with over 4,500 stores. These were all mainly in the States, but also some in Canada and the US Pacific territories. The company was truly enormous by this point, its brand and presence widely known across the country, it being the go-to place for self-service, low-priced shoes, most Americans never living too far away from one. It was a cornerstone for the shoe markets, and it was not hard to find a Payless ShoeSource at your nearest mall or shopping plaza. They were simply everywhere. However, while sales more or less stayed relatively steady, it looked like May's earlier premonition of their waning market dominance was proving to be correct. Those big box stores like Target, Kmart, and mainly Walmart were offering their own discount shoes at competitive prices. And as those brands continued to expand, more consumers began choosing them. And it makes sense. There is certainly more of a convenience factor for consumers to pick up their shoes at the same place they would already be shopping in for other goods. Why make a special trip out to Payless when you can just pick up similar quality shoes at Walmart, Target, or Kmart, a place you're already going to be at? This was a serious threat, and through the millennium, the company continued to post record sales of nearly $3 billion in 2000, but that same year, they declined in net earnings. The brand would be sidelined by yet another existential threat to their business: online shopping. While Payless.com was launched, they would also set up a store-within-a-store concept within the Shopko department store brand, a way to stake their own ground in the increasingly popular big box stores. The company would also bridge out into other markets, like expanding their footprint in Canada, as well as marking territory in South and Central America. While Payless was still the largest footwear retailer in the Western Hemisphere, things only continued to get worse for the brand. Following the ousting of their CEO and the announcement that they would be scaling back advertising spending, as well as closing over 500 stores, their stock took a massive hit. The company would lose money in both 2003 and 2004, though would bounce back to profitability by 2006. They would also begin a rebrand and focus on more stylish shoes, overall with a desire to build a more contemporary public image of Payless as a whole. But the future was becoming a lot more clear that tumultuous days laid ahead. They would also change their corporate image too. In 2007, they purchased the footwear brand Stride Right, as well as all of its subsidiary brands like Sperry. The corporate moniker would change to Collective Brands Inc. Despite this big rebranding though, they just had too many stores to reasonably update, which meant many of them remained a tired-looking retail location stuck in the 1980s. It didn't help that their technology, including their electronic inventory systems, were also stuck in a similar decade. While competition grew even more fierce and difficult to compete with, Payless's entire store portfolio was another problem slowly coming to light. While some locations were standalone or in popular strip plazas, many others were in shopping malls malls. Now, this was great when people were actually visiting them, but as we know, indoor shopping malls, especially ones which catered to discount stores and lower-end retailers, the exact type of malls Payless chose to occupy, had severely declined. The amount of people who were willing to make an entire trip out to a dead mall just to go to a Payless shoe store was in freefall. And by 2011, their finances reflected that, as the company posted a $160 million net loss that fiscal year. That same year, the company announced that it had begun looking for a buyer, and in early 2012, a lifeline was seemingly thrown their way. Seemingly. Two private equity firms, Blum Capital Partners and Golden Gate Capital, would acquire Collective Brands Inc. for around $1.3 billion. Now, Golden Gate Capital might sound familiar to you, though, and that might be because they were also the same private equity firm that acquired Red Lobster. And, yeah. Unsurprisingly, this was done as a leveraged buyout, as they would put up some money for the acquisition, but also take out a huge amount of debt to complete the purchase. Debt that would be in the tune of a couple $100 million, all of which would now be saddled on Payless. But the company, which was renamed to Payless Holdings, was updated with new investments. But they also faced harsh downsizing to their corporate offices, as well as many store closures. While this was seen as a necessary evil, it didn't get much better, as over the years following their acquisition, the private equity firms would essentially pay themselves around $350 million in the form of dividends. According to the New York Times, during this period, for every dollar the company earned, they paid out $1.09 to their owners. This only exacerbated the company's overall debt issues and siphoned off most of their free cash. Now, the company would actually get sued for this later, though the company would ultimately settle out of court, with the private equity firms never admitting fault. Regardless, this put Payless in an ever more increasingly desperate situation, and as they quickly burned through their remaining liquid cash, there was a very real chance that the company could be headed for bankruptcy. Indeed it was, and on April 4th, 2017, that's exactly what happened, as Payless declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, hoping to eliminate over $435 million worth of debts. Following this filing, they had immediately closed over 400 locations, and did indeed reduce their existing debt load through negotiations. Everything at the company largely continued on, and they did actually emerge from bankruptcy 4 months later. When they did, though, more than 673 locations had been shuttered, and they took on new investors like Alden Global Capital, another private equity firm which now became the majority shareholder. They had a little experience in the retail sector and was more familiar in distressed media companies. They were joined by Axar Capital Management, yet another private equity firm. Regardless, they helped revive the company and brought it out of bankruptcy. But that didn't change the fact that the brand was still facing head-on the harsh realities of the retail marketplace. Brick-and-mortar stores have been through a massive transformation, primarily due to shoppers choosing to do their purchasing online. Payless didn't have a good online presence and only saw a fraction of their sales through their website. This was all while their existing dated stores continued to fade into obscurity. Since the company was no longer public, there really isn't much data on how exactly the brand was doing. But it certainly can be assumed that the answer was not very good at all. Truly, to bring Payless back from the brink of extinction was a daunting challenge, and with so much pitted against the brand, they were once again heading for disaster. On February 14th, 2019, Payless Shoes filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the second time they would do so. It had only been a little over 22 months since their first filing, and while that one ended with operations continuing on somewhat normally, this one would not. With around $470 million in outstanding debts, Payless ShoeSource announced that they would be shutting down its remaining 2,500 stores in the United States and 248 stores in Canada. While their locations in Latin America and their franchise stores overseas would remain, this would be it for their American operations, and the majority of both their stores as well as their online e-commerce platform. In just a few weeks, locations all over America began to close, a staggering number of retail stores all shuttering together. This mass closure resulted in around 16,000 employees being laid off, and by summer of 2019, all stores had closed, and that was it for Payless Shoes. Or was it? In early 2020, the company actually emerged from its bankruptcy, now as Payless ShoeSource Worldwide LLC. And with new management behind the brand, they had promised to not only continue their overseas partnerships, but to also renew focus on the US market? Yeah, this would not only include a new e-commerce platform, but also standalone stores. They even stated in August of 2020 that they were planning to open another 300 to 400 stores nationwide by 2025. While one did end up opening in North Miami by 2021, it would later close within just 2 years. They also did launch a new website in mid-2020. However, it too would only last a few years, as it was shut down in August of 2023. They left a vague, "we've got something in the works" message, and links to their Amazon listings for footwear, which is kind of ironic. And really, that's where the brand has been left now. The downfall of Payless is a frustrating one. While there was no doubt that the company had been declining for years, it's not like they were on life support in 2011. They were still making over $3.6 billion in sales a year before they went private. And while they did lose some money that year, it followed a string of profitable years. And this was all while they were continuing to pay down their debt. After their buyout of private equity firms, we don't know what their detailed financial situations were. But we do know that they did little to help the chain succeed. What Payless needed was support. They needed to dramatically update their existing stores, bolster their online presence, and create a shopping experience that will actually get people to visit their stores. Most analysts agree that Payless was a company that could very realistically have been saved. In reality, though, they received minimal aid, and instead were buried by debt that was taken out to acquire the corporation, then had more debt added to pay out dividend bonuses to their new owners. Bonuses for their new owners who were actively suffocating the company. I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been for local sales associates who were making on average $9.50 an hour to see their corporate owners who failed them pay out hundreds of millions of dollars in dividends to themselves. I'm honestly just genuinely shocked at how often this story tends to repeat itself. A massive historic brand ingrained in the American market, which had come in hard times, was bought out by private equity and loaded with an unmanageable amount of debt, lack of leadership, and in this case, just greed. Payless could have weathered the storm, but instead, like so many other companies, it was purchased as an investment, squeezed for everything it had, and was buried by debt that it didn't need. In the end, its death brought with it the shuttering of over 2,000 stores, many of which are now just left abandoned, and the elimination of over 16,000 jobs. It not only left landlords, suppliers, and creditors in a pinch, but with one less major discount footwear retailer, it allowed the whole market to grow a bit smaller, giving major corporations like Walmart and Amazon the ability to raise their margins. Without more competition, it makes the market worse for the average consumer. It is an immensely frustrating and frankly infuriating story of a company that at one point in the 80s and 90s rose to incredible heights. Over 4,500 stores, close to 5,000 if you include everything that was under their umbrella. That's incredible. But in just a few short decades, it would all fall just as fast as it rose, only for them to meet a bitter, bankrupt end.